want to go over. I don't know about you guys, but I'm one. I just love to get into what some would call extra biblical things. Um, and by extra biblical, I mean things that help to prove that God's word is exactly what it is. Now, granted, we have the Bible itself, which stands on its own, obviously, but I like to look at archaeology and manuscript evidence and other things. And I was reading through an old document just a couple of days ago that I hadn't read in quite a while. It's probably 15 to 20 years old, but it's a fellow by the name of Dave Hunt. Dave has long since gone to be with the Lord, and he's somebody I listened to faithfully for many, many years. And he pointed something out in a document that I just happened to pick up and read, and I'll just read through it, and I think hopefully you'll find it interesting. But he's referring to some work done by a fellow back in the 1800s. His name was Dr. Robert D. Wilson. Probably wrote this or completed this study that we're just going to talk about somewhere, I'm going to say around 1890, 1885, somewhere around there. He was a Princeton University professor, and one of the most, as Dave pointed out in this interview, he says uh, one of the greatest language experts and scholars of all times. He was fluent in more than 40 Semitic languages, and by Semitic, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, and who knows what else is included in the list. And so he wrote a book, and I just want to read something that I don't know, maybe it won't mean anything to you. It's kind of short, but we'll just go through it. It just was just one more piece of evidence that kind of struck me. But anyway, he says in his book, for I don't know what the name of the book is, to be honest with you, but his name is Dr. Robert E. Wilson, Princeton University professor. Uh, in this book, he says for 45 years continuously. Now, remember, this is written back in the late 1800s or so. I've devoted myself to one great study of the Old Testament in all its languages, in all its archaeology, in all its transactions. And what he's talking about here is still pertinent today because you have many people out there that are trying to refute the Bible and so forth. Because I understand the critics of the Bible who go to it in order to find fault claim to themselves all knowledge and all virtue and all love of truth. So those that claim that the Bible is inconsistent or it's this or it's that, they're essentially claiming that they have all knowledge and all truth. One of their favorite phrases is, quote, all scholars agree. When a man says that, I wish to know who the scholars are and why they agree. Where do they get their evidence? I defy any man to make an attack upon the Old Testament on the ground of evidence that I cannot investigate. After I learned the necessary languages, I set about the investigation of every consonant in the Hebrew Old Testament, and it took me many years to achieve my task. I had to observe the variations in the texts, in the manuscripts, or in the notes of the Masoretes, who are the Hebrews that actually translated the Old Testament, and a little bit about the translations. The translations were basically completed using a system called equal distance numbering or lettering sequencing. And so those that actually copied the original manuscripts were so diligent and so faithful that it's almost impossible that any error would have been found. And just to give you one example, when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they found evidence of virtually every book except for Esther, and they have a complete copy of the book of Isaiah that dates back roughly 100 BC or so, not the original manuscript, but of the, copies of the original manuscript. Up until that point, the newest or the earliest that they had dated to 900 AD. And when they compared that which they had that was copied and reviewed in 900 to the Dead Sea Scroll from that particular book 1,000 years earlier, there was there were no changes. They were identical. And so there's at least 24,000 manuscripts out there. When we say manuscripts, copies of the original text. And none of them, you can't find any evidence in anywhere that there's any errors or any inconsistencies. And so I find that the manuscript evidence is also, as far as I'm concerned, pretty amazing, or the various versions, or in the parallel passages, or in the conjectural emendations, which means those that have basically been revised or corrected. So what he did is he took the Masoret text, the original manuscripts, the oldest he had, parallel path. He just studied everything and looked at it from a lens of the actual ancient language. And then I had to classify the results to reduce the Old Testament criticism to an absolutely objective science, something which is based on evidence and not opinion. So what he came up with is actual evidence. And here's just one thing that I found pretty amazing he came up with. The results of those 45 years of study, which I have given to the text, has been this. I can affirm, let's just go back to the late 1800s, there's not a page of the Old Testament concerning which we need have any doubt. And he says, and now he gives us an example. He said there are 29 ancient kings whose names are mentioned not only in the Bible, but also on monuments of their own time. So, in other words, there are 29 names that they derived or that he found in the Bible that he compared or were compared to monuments that were made to these individuals at the time. I mean, there are more kings than that, but these in this day they have found 29 of them whose names were mentioned on monuments of their own image. So a monument and recorded in the Bible. There are 195 consonants in these 29 proper names. Yet we find that in the documents of the Hebrew Old Testament, there are only two or three out of the 195 uh, which there can be any question of their being written in exactly the same way as they were inscribed on their monuments. So, in other words, what we find in the scriptures, the Bible, about these 29 kings and what is written on the monuments are identical. So, in other words, the monuments confirm what is written in the scriptures. Um, he says some of these go back 4,000 years and are so written that every letter is clear and correct. Compare this accuracy with the greatest scholar of his age, the librarian of Alexander in 200 BC. He compiled a catalog of the kings of Egypt, 38 in all. Of the entire number, only 3 or 4 are recognizable. He also made a list of the kings of Assyria. In only one case can we tell who is meant, and that is not spelt correctly. Or take Ptolemy, who drew up a register of 18 kings of Babylon. Not one of them is properly spelled. You could not make them out at all if you did not know from other sources to what he is referring. If anyone talks about the Bible, ask him about the kings mentioned in it. There are 29 kings referred to, 10 different countries. So these 29 kings uh, come from 10 different countries, Moab, wherever they may be, all of which are included in the Bible and on the monuments. Every one of these is given his right name in the Bible, his right country, and placed in correct chronological order. Think of what that means. So that's just one of those things that I find kind of fascinating when you come across things like that. So just more evidence.
Writing, the scribe to write the Torah, if they make a mistake, just like one letter,
Right, they throw it out.
they don't throw it out,
Right.
bury it. They don't fix it. There's no white out there.
Right.
They throw it out.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you say copies, you don't mean like off a Xerox machine.
No, these are.
Copies, you just wonder. These are.
If you go to Israel, there are still places today where they have people actually copying the manuscripts, and it's a gift to be able to do that.
But where? If you go to Israel, they're copying the manuscripts where?
Remember we were there and we saw those people in that one room. I don't remember where it was, but someplace in Israel.
Something here, it's vacation villa
Yeah,
on the Dead Sea.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
pretty sure it was up there. There was one guy in a room.
yeah.
Looking.
Yes, exactly.
I think that-
Yeah.
From the slot.
And you can buy a letter.
There you go.
Or, no, you can. You can like buy a letter and that letter is dedicated to you and you get a piece of paper and it goes in certain Torah and you can visit Torah, see who the Torah is. Some people
Yeah.
hire a scribe to write a Torah for them and honor
Right.
somebody who might have died.
So what this means is that's just one more piece of evidence that everything written here is 100% verifiable, 100% accurate. That's why the Second Timothy says that all Scripture is God breathed, and that means every letter, every word, every chapter, every verse is inspired by God. It has one author, even though there are 40 different people that penned his words. He is the sole author of what we find today. And so, with the evidence of fulfilled prophecy, manuscript evidence, archaeological evidence, eyewitness accounts, on and on and on, to say nothing of the Bible proving itself, when we think about what's yet to happen, we know it's going to happen, and we can see so many things coming together today that confirm that what's yet to happen is going to take place. So, I want to get into our overheads here in a moment, but just a quick update. We talked a little bit about central bank digital currencies. We don't hear a lot about it in the news, but here's just an update as to what's going on with CBDCs. And what do I mean by CBDC? Central bank digital currency. That's central banks in all of the countries that will remove cash from the system and transact business using this digital currency. They call it central bank digital currency. Ultimately, it'll all lead to one CBDC. So you have, just as a way of an update, been a lot of CBDC research and development. Make the mainstream media and others make it sound like it doesn't even exist. 130 countries are currently exploring them. That number represents 98% of global GDP. 64 countries are in the advanced stages of exploration and are either ready to launch or pilot CBDCs. The European Central Bank recently announced that it is ready to enter the preparation phase, which will allow them to agree on the foundations of a digital euro. And I think, 23, 27 nations represented in the European Union that'll have one digital euro. Currently, they have the actual euro. In PetroChina, a major Chinese oil company has already completed their first international crude oil trade, using the digital yuan, which is the Chinese currency. China right now has developed the wholesale CBDC, not the retail, but they are working on that. So they're beginning to use it for large commercial transactions. The most considerable progress has been made in Europe. The head of the ECB, European Central Bank, stated that the digital euro was designed as a form of cash. I think we know that. She also stated that the digital euro will provide instant settlements. They claim that that's one of the benefits of digital currencies. It'll be instantaneous. Well, I don't see where that's a big deal. It's not as though it takes forever now, but what they want is just another piece of evidence of how they're trying to gain control of everything, because these digital currencies are going to be what they call programmable. So they're going to be able to determine everything you do. It's hard to know what this means when the concept of CBDC removes the concept of privacy altogether. They're currently working on incentives for banks and other payment processors to ensure it's widely accepted, which means banks and so forth will only accept the digital euro for certain services. They'll start with social and government payments first, uh, so that nobody can really refuse it. The European Central Bank is not the only bank that's making considerable progress. Argentina reported that it's working on the legal framework for CBDC in pesos. The Reserve Bank in Australia is in partnership with MasterCard, involved in a CBDC blockchain pilot program. So they're already piloting it in Australia, um, which is reported to have been successfully concluded, was successfully concluded in 2023. So far, we don't know the results of the tests. Um, the central bank appears as though they're going to be ready for implementation in a few years. And in Australia, it sounds like they're not anxious to move real quickly, but they're working on it nonetheless. Brazil is working on its first phase of the digital real, which is scheduled for May 2024. China's ahead of the game. We know that. The recent oil purchase we just talked about was for 1 million barrels of crude that was settled by the Shanghai Petroleum, Oil, and Natural Gas Exchange. China's also rolled out a limited scope pilot for retail CBDC, which just simply means that's how people will buy and sell.
They ran a test during the Olympics where people that came to the Olympics in China were not allowed to buy anything except in digital yuan.
Really? I did not know that.
Transfer your money.
Yeah,
to the
yep.
Before you could spend anything.
Yep.
You said they ran a test?
Yeah,
Say it.
they were testing it out.
Okay.
The Reserve Bank of India has launched a pilot phase where they plan to process 1 million transactions by the end of 2023. Again, not clear where that's gone. Japan, things are moving a bit slower, but the Bank of Japan is developing a retail CBDC that will be used by average consumers. It's working with 60 companies for the pilot of the digital yen. The Philippines decided to start with a wholesale CBDC first. They're piloting the digital peso for large foreign currency transfers. Russia is moving along a similar path, with the parliament having approved a digital ruble bill back in mid 2023, and a pilot program has been launched. South Korea developed wholesale and retail versions simultaneously. They are currently testing wholesale CBDC and plan to do the same for retail later this year. European countries can also develop their own CBDCs. Switzerland has made considerable progress with the Swiss Central Bank, having partnered with 6 commercial banks in the country to launch a pilot of wholesale Swiss franc. The test is expected to be completed by June. So, as the person I was listening to said, all of this is life changing. So why isn't it being reported? So that's just kind of an overview of what's going on. The United States, we're not hearing a whole lot about what's happening. I know that some bills have been introduced to keep it from happening. So we'll have to wait and see. But this is just one more step. And why do we talk about CBDC? Because it is a stage setting for the time when Antichrist will come on the scene and control all global commerce. And we read in Revelation 13, people will not be able to buy or sell without the mark of the beast. So he and his minions probably, not probably, will definitely have to implement artificial intelligence to make this all work. So it's heading in that direction. Okay, another quick update, 2 more, and then we'll get into Daniel 9. Uh, Here's a quick thing I learned, or update on, Jesus when he gave the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and so forth. one of the things he said is there'll be wars and rumors of wars breaking out virtually everywhere. And rumors of wars means threats of wars. And so just might surprise us a little bit to learn that right now, just in Africa alone, there are 35 armed conflicts, just in Africa. Iran and its proxies have formed what they call the Axis of Resistance. That's Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, all part of the axis of resistance through Iran. And then there have been 100, I don't know, you probably heard this on the news, 130 attacks by this axis of resistance against U.S. bases in Israel and Syria. So it's like they're trying to pull us into this. And I think we heard today that there have been more attacks today against the Houthis, primarily by the United States and Great Britain. So we are engaged as far as that's concerned. Iran just recently launched 3 missile and drone attacks against Syria, Iraq, and Pakistan in just one 24-hour period. It's like Iran is just totally losing it. You know, it's just out there. In fact, I just read today, I don't know if you saw it in the news, but they just executed a young guy. I think he was 23 years old, because he was a voice for women's rights in Iran. That was his charge. He was arguing for female rights in Iran, and as a result, they hung him. So that's how evil that regime is, under the total control of Satan himself. Iran attacked Syria because that's where ISIS is headquartered. Iran and ISIS are really, ISIS is a Sunni group. Iran is a Shia group, and it was ISIS that took responsibility a week or two ago for the bombing on the day they were celebrating Soleimani's execution. And I think there were, 200 killed in that attack. And fortunately, ISIS took responsibility. Otherwise, they would have blamed, who for it. It was ISIS that recently killed many Iranians at a memorial service for Soleimani. They fired against Iran because they feared that there were Israeli Mossad members. Iran fired against Iraq because they feared there were Israeli Mossad members there, and Pakistan because of their fear of terrorists. So it's like they're becoming paranoid all of a sudden. Terrorists, according to the New York Times, these attacks are inflaming tensions in the region. The U.S. commandeered missiles that Iran was shipping to the Houthis in Yemen. There is a billboard in Iran with a missile and writing below it in Persian and Hebrew that states, "Prepare your coffins." The U.S., United Kingdom, and Australia have been hitting targets in Yemen. Then, of course, we have Israel, Gaza, Hezbollah, Yemen, Syria, the West Bank terrorists, China, and Taiwan just elected a new leader who is very much against China, and that's not going to set well with China. He's very anti-China, and the goal of China, of course, still has its goal of, quote, unifying China. Recently, 18 Air Force planes were operating around Taiwan, Chinese. Kim Jong-un, our friend in North Korea, recently declared South Korea to be its #1 enemy. The Korean Peninsula is now more dangerous than any time since the Korean War in the 50s. French news articles have warned that North Korea could be preparing for war with South Korea. Russia-Ukraine war now enters its third year. An up-to-date news article said a Russian ally stated that World War III will definitely begin in the Middle East. And I'm going to read an article in a moment. I might take some exception to that, but we just don't know. Fox News reported that Germany is preparing for Russia to start World War III. The report says that Russia could be preparing for an attack against NATO. NATO was set up for one purpose, to defend against Russia. And so anytime a nation joins NATO, it's a slap in Russia's face. And today, Sweden moved that much closer to becoming a member of NATO as it was approved by Turkey, which was one of the final things that had to be taken care of. Finland is also moving in that direction, and it's been, as I'll mention in this article in just a moment. It was stated by one of the leaders in Sweden that people need to be ready for war. Sweden's has always been a neutral country. I'm not sure they have much of a military, so that's just one more thing. Uh, you say this is Germany. Russia would start waging war in the Baltics this coming July by imposing severe cyber attacks while stirring discontent among Russian nationals in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. By September, those clashes could be used by Russia as an excuse to unleash a major, large scale military exercise in 2024 that would amass 50,000 Russian soldiers west in the country of Belarus. With the coming 2024 U.S. elections, Russia could use propaganda proclaiming fictional border conflicts and riots to incite violence and unrest. While all of this is speculation, Germany is actively preparing for just such a possible scenario. So, wars and rumors of wars, just as Jesus said, and it's expanding very, very quickly.
Let's not forget that, um, Iran now, well, it's been reported that Iran now has enough plutonium for a few nuclear
Right.
bombs. And let's also remember that Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has said that it will never permit Iran to have a nuclear bomb.
Right.
How close is that conflict?
Yeah, that's a big unknown. Big unknown. Uh,
Israel has continuously gone in there, it's not published in the news, and they go in and they constantly uproot their capability. So it doesn't necessarily have to wait to get that big. I'm sure they're in there undoing it. I can't imagine.
I think they're going to preemptively strike, but I think God might have a slightly different approach. And I'm going to go through an article here, and there's some statements. I'm going to put my own spin on it, but and I don't mean to read this to scare people, but it is what it is. This is the conditions that we see in the world today. And the title of this article is Why Are Leaders All Over the World Warning that World War III is Very Close?
Thank you.
It's on to say prominent leaders all over the globe are starting to publicly announce that World War III is coming. Now, that doesn't mean it is, but this is speculation. In many cases, they're expressing hope that it can still be avoided, but that becomes less likely with each passing day. Multiple parties are escalating the conflict in the Middle East. The war in Ukraine has entered a dangerous new phase. And the election that just happened in Taiwan has made a Chinese invasion much more probable. We really are on the brink of the unthinkable. But most people in the general population have no idea how dire things have become. Remember, wars and rumors of wars. And Jesus went on to explain that when these things start to happen, that he used the birth pang metaphor. And as time goes on, these things are going to become more frequent and more intense. So I don't think it's practical or reasonable to think things are going to get better. If in fact we're in the last days, which I think most of us would agree we're rapidly approaching. On Monday, British Defense Minister Grant Shapps warned that we are now in a pre-war world and that Western powers could soon find themselves fighting Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. He went on to say the era of peace dividend is over. In 5 years' time, we could be looking at multiple theaters, including those we just mentioned. And the author says, I was stunned that he was willing to give the public such an honest assessment. But of course, he's right. Multiple wars he says, I would say, could be coming. U.S. officials are issuing similar warnings. Here's one example. The source inside the Pentagon has warned Daily Express U.S. that, quote, we are on the brink of World War III amid surging conflict in the Middle East sparked largely by Iran. The source inside the Pentagon that issued this rather ominous warning is a man named Nicholas Drummond, and he claims that the current war in the Middle East could literally result in, quote, the end of Iran. He goes on to say, echoed concerns that the conflict in the Middle East could potentially escalate, but warned that if Tehran directly attacked Israel, the ensuing war would be the end of Iran. Now, that's where I take issue. I take issue because Iran will effectively be eliminated along with Russia, along with Turkey, along with Libya, and along with the Sudan and possibly even Ethiopia, as clearly articulated in Ezekiel 38. And that's not going to be because Israel takes them out. Now, I'm not saying that Israel might not conduct a preemptive strike, but the end of Iran, I believe, will come when this confederacy moves on Israel, and the stage is being set for just that, the fulfillment of that event. It's just happening so rapidly with Russia and Iran developing closer than ever relations, and with Erdogan and Turkey going really off the deep end, and Libya in cahoots with Russia, as is the Sudan, and even to the point now where Ethiopia is migrating toward a Russian alliance. And so all of the parts, all of the components of Ezekiel 38 are coming together. And we know that the outcome of this invasion is going to be that God is going to destroy 6/7 of this confederacy. That's clearly stated in the King James Version of the early verses of Ezekiel 39. And so he's going to have the soldiers turn on each other. There's going to be great earthquakes. God is going to do it. It's not Israel that's going to do it. So I believe that this guy is correct. That Iran could be significantly in the not too distant future reduced in terms of power. That doesn't mean they're not going to continue to wreak havoc, but the end of them is going to come as clearly outlined in Ezekiel 38. So, what sort of weapons would be required to bring the war to bring about the quote end of Iran? I wrote a word here that's irrelevant, that it's not really what the Bible says as far as the end of Iran is concerned. There's also a lot of talk about World War III in Russia. In fact, one of Russia's most prominent news anchors, named Vladimir Solovov, recently told his audience that our planet is moving toward World War III. In my opinion, it's already underway. And so he goes on, World War III, we're very close. I don't know if you feel it. I don't know, Madam Attorney General, if you feel it, but we're very close to World War III when you see these discussions taking place. The following comes from a Daily Mail article entitled The Descent into World War III: How Russia, Iran, and China are simultaneously making moves that will drag us into conflict. And I'm not going to read more of this. I think we all get the gist of it. I will say this, though. Here's that part I mentioned about Sweden. Swedish military commander in chief General Michael Biden supported this take, saying Swedes should prepare mentally for the possibility of a conflict in light of the rising global tensions and the constant threat posed by Russia. And you can see how and why that would take place with them now becoming or soon to become a member of NATO when they've been neutral all this time. Putin said the West, took Finland and dragged it into NATO. Why did we have any disputes? Why did we have any disputes with Finland? Remember, NATO is a body that is or determined to defend against Russian aggression. All disputes, including those of this is Putin speaking, including those of a territorial nature in the middle of the 20th century, have all been resolved long ago. There are no problems, but but now there will be, because we will now create the Leningrad Military District and will definitely concentrate military units there. Deputy Chair of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, claimed in a post to X in early December that there hasn't been such a high threat of direct confrontation between Russia and NATO since the Cold War, criticizing President Joe Biden's administration for funding Ukraine's fight against Russia and causing a prolonged war. And then it goes on and on and on. So wars and rumors of wars. I think that it's pretty clear that we see that it's really taking shape. So does that mean that we should run scared of World War III? I still am of the firm belief, and I'm hardly the authority, but I believe that the rapture is probably going to take place before that. I think the rapture is so close. And that's our hope, and I just don't see all of these world wars breaking out and essentially allowing the church to go through it. Now, I could be wrong. I mean, we've talked about this before. There's nothing that says that we won't go through persecutions and tribulations. But as far as that which is uh, coming and everybody seems to be afraid of, and so on and so forth, things that are only going to get worse and worse. So,
I continue to be amazed every week that with the various people that I interact with outside of this church, really outside of this class, almost no one has awareness of what you just talked about, that long list. And certainly have any sense of what it all adds up to, what it all means,
correct. Yeah,
where we might be headed, either speaking secularly as World War III, or speaking biblically as the rapture.
right, right,
They seem to have no interest, no knowledge,
right.
no nothing.
To say nothing,
Unbelievable.
to say nothing of the irrational hatred of Israel, the anti-Semitism that we're seeing, and that's what anti-Semitism is. It's an irrational hatred of the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. And I have an article here. I don't have time to go through it now. I'll do it next time. Written by Dr. David Reagan, if anybody knows him. And he says it a whole lot better than I do, but he goes through and clarifies all of the slogans that we hear all the time relative to Israel. For example, set Israel free from the river to the sea. It was interesting. I was watching the news the other day and they were asking protesters, well, what river are we talking about? What sea? They have no clue. They have no clue. And what this particular phrase or statement means is that all of Israel has to be wiped out of all the Jews have to be eliminated. That's what it means. And the idea of a two-state solution, that's an absolute joke. Even Hamas has stated that they're not interested in a two-state solution, as has the Palestinian Authority. It's a total joke. But our crazy administration's trying to force all of this to take place. And we need to pray, I believe, for Bibi Netanyahu, who's under such pressure from evil regimes like the Biden administration, who they don't have a clue what they're doing to us. It's just despicable. So that's one. The end of apartheid in Israel. You hear that Israel is an apartheid state. Well, what does apartheid mean? Apartheid means that the government separates groups of people. Well, in Israel, 20% of the population is Arabs. So-called Palestinians are allowed to serve in the Knesset. They don't have to serve in the military, but they're allowed to serve in the Knesset. They receive all the same benefits. It's not an apartheid state by any stretch of the imagination. That's their parliament.
But the Arab nations that used to have Jews expelled them.
Exactly. Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's
Yep. free Palestine from colonial oppression. And what that means is that uh, colonialism means that a country is moved in and taken over, you know, and basically this is where the term occupied Israel comes from. You can't occupy what you own. Israel, the Jews own Israel. God gave it to them. The United States or United Nations mandated it to them. They own it legally and biblically. So you can't occupy what you own. And so we're going to continue to hear that garbage all the time. And even end 75 years of occupation, the same thing. So I just think it's important for us. Oh, another one that we hear, free Gaza, stop the Israeli genocide. You know, the ones that are committing genocide, if Hamas wanted this war to end, they would surrender, give up the hostages, and it would be over right away. But as Bibi Netanyahu said, that if we were to lay down, or if Hamas were to lay down their arms and surrender, there would be peace. Everything would be over. If we laid down our arms, we would be fighting against Hamas. Hamas would come after us. So, free Gaza, another nonsensical slogan. You know, I don't know if people understand, but in 2005, every Jew in Gaza was physically removed. They had to burn down, destroy their synagogues uh, because they didn't want them to be desecrated. They destroyed the economy. Israel was in the process of creating in Gaza an oasis on the sea. It was going to be a fantastic tourist place, and so they left. And how can you say free Gaza? There's no Jews living there. How can you free? Yeah,
What?
right. Yeah. Stop the Israeli genocide, the same thing. And, you know, we keep hearing that, South Africa forces are asked the International Court to bring charges of genocide against Israel. They actually, and I don't know how it works, but they actually had a hearing at the International Criminal Court last week. And because South Africa is claiming that Israel's committing genocide.
And Germany came.
Have to be, huh?
Germany, of all nations, Germany came to Israel's defense.
Right. Right. So, but at any rate, we just need to be aware of these things, I believe, because the propaganda against poor Israel is just overwhelming. And what's most important is that this is God's land. And God's made it very clear that He's going to curse those that curse Israel. And God's about to curse the world for what it's doing to Israel. Make no mistake about it. So it's coming. All right. Questions, comments on any of that? We went over it very quickly. There's so much more we could talk about.
Well, you mentioned genocide in Gaza. Just a little statistic. I think that I don't know, whenever Gaza was created, but I think it started off with 700,000 Gazans, and now there's over 2 million. So genocide, usually people don't multiply.
Right. Correct.
At least to my
Yeah. Yeah. It's a small area and it's very densely populated. And you know, the leaders of Hamas are worth a combined $11 billion. All of this aid, and there's been billions of dollars sent to support and by the way, 86% of people living in Gaza, whether they're terrorists or not, support what Hamas did on October 7th. The numbers are equally as high in the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority is. So, enough to be said there. So, I want to get back into Daniel. I put together Daniel's 70-week prophecy. I have found over the years that this is one of the more difficult things to explain because of all the detail that's associated with it. But it's one of the most significant prophecies in all of the Bible. It has first coming and second coming implications, and so I put this thing together. It's not it's not all inclusive by any stretch of the imagination, but let's just take a look real quick. Um, Back at the beginning, we've gone over this, and let's just take a look at Second Chronicles chapter 36. And you think if you're going back in your Bible that it means it preceded or predated Daniel, but it didn't. Actually, Second Chronicles was obviously written after the book of Daniel. But I want to read in Second Chronicles chapter 36, beginning in verse 21, where it says, "The land enjoyed its Sabbath rest." Remember, the reason for the captivity, the reason why Israel was exiled to Babylon was because they did not obey the command to let the land lie fallow or not be tilled every 7 years. And this went on for a period of 490 years, so 10 times for each one of affliction. So that meant of the 49 years, they would be held in captivity for a total of 70 years. That was a prophecy that we read about in Jeremiah. But here in Second Chronicles, the land enjoyed its Sabbath rest. All the time of its desolation, it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. So the author of Second Chronicles, just like Daniel, had access to uh, the scrolls that Jeremiah had written, wherein it states very clearly that this desolation or this period of exile would last 70 years. So it says that the land, the desolation, the land rested completely. There was no tilling of the land at all during that entire 70-year period, which was God's punishment against them. Then it goes on to say, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his land and also put it in writing. This is what, remember, Cyrus is mentioned in the book of Isaiah, some 150 years before he even comes on the scene. And so Cyrus, the king of Persia at this time, this is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says: "The Lord, the God of heaven." It kind of makes me think that when we get to heaven, we'll see Cyrus there. I think there's a good chance we'll see Nebuchadnezzar there as well. Uh, but at any rate, the Lord called Cyrus his servant. So, I mean, it seems pretty reasonable to me. "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth." So, Cyrus was the leader of the Mede-Persian Empire, which basically was the world ruling empire at this time. They had defeated Babylon, had overtaken Babylon, and became the ruler of the world at this time. They subsequently were defeated by the Greeks, and the Greeks were subsequently defeated and overtaken by the Romans. So you had those four, and then prior to that, you had Egypt and Assyria as well, but to a lesser degree, Assyria. So you had Babylon, Mede Persia, where Cyrus was the king. Now, what's important here is that Daniel, as we read, was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. And this is probably around 60 years after that. So Daniel was probably in his teens, late teens, early 20s when he was abducted, taken into Babylon. So this is probably getting, or when he has his prophecy in Daniel 9, getting pretty close to the end of that 70 years. And because he read the scroll, the Jeremiah scroll, he knew that that time of captivity was about to come to an end. And so here we see Cyrus, king of Persia: "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, May the Lord their God be with them. And so this is not the decree, as we mentioned the last time, that begins the 70-week prophecy, but uh, at this time, Cyrus says, okay, Israelites, you've been in captivity now long enough. You can go back to Israel and rebuild your temple, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians. And so this is at about that 70-year period. And if we go to Jeremiah chapter 29, in verse 10, this is what the Lord says: when the 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you, Israel, back to this place. So there we have the stage set by uh, and why Daniel started this prayer that we read about in Daniel chapter 9. And what it does is it leads us up to, and we read the first part of this the last time we got together, but this leads us up to probably the most one of, if not the most important specific prophecy in all of the Bible. As we go through this, beginning in verse 20, uh, we see references to the first coming and to the second coming. So it's important to understand, as we see in verse 24, 77s are decreed. By decreed means this is it, God has stated it. This is Gabriel bringing a message to Daniel from God Almighty. Gabriel being a messenger, archangel. And so he's bringing this message and he's repeating and telling Daniel specifically exactly what God says. Well, when it says 77s are decreed, in some translations says determined, that means they're set in stone. There's no change in it. There are going to be 77s. And then it gets more into that. So this is and then he goes on to say 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city. So this 77s or 490-year prophecy is specific to Israel. It has nothing to do with the church, and that's been important because there's one 7-year period yet to come. 483 years have already transpired. One 70-year period yet to come. And so it's important to understand that this is all about Israel. When we get to that final 7-year period, often referred to as the time of Jacob's trouble, the tribulation, the time of the wrath, the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord's wrath, the day of God's, etc., all meaning the same thing, that it's all about Israel. And so if that final 7-year period, which has not yet taken place, and we know specifically when it'll start from what we read in just a second here, that there's no need for the church. The church, this is not about the church, the 7-year period. All the more reason for the church not to be here. Another reason for the rapture. And when I say church, I mean today, from the time of Jesus' ascension, when he lifted up to heaven, and then he sent the Holy Spirit on that upper room, which is what we know to be Pentecost. That started a big long gap between week 69 and 70, known as the church age, the time of grace. The time, as Jesus said in Matthew 16, I will build my church. And so the church had not been built. But when we get to that fine, so we're in the age of grace right now, the church age, while God is building, Jesus is building his church and has been for the last 2,000 years, but at a point known only to him, and we see the evidence that it's probably going to be pretty soon, uh, the rapture is going to take place, and then he's going to focus his attention on Israel. So, verse 20, while I was speaking and praying, so Daniel's prayer is interrupted. That's why some refer to Daniel 9 as the interrupted prayer. And while I was speaking in prayer and confessing my sin and the sin of my people, it's interesting that Daniel didn't say, God, forgive my brethren, forgive my people. He said, forgive us. We've sinned against you. Kind of like David outlined in Psalm 51. Israel, in making my request to the Lord for his holy hill, a reference to Jerusalem. While I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I had seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift light about the time of the evening sacrifice, probably like 3 in the afternoon or so. He instructed me and said to me, Daniel, I have now come to give you insight and understanding. So Gabriel is about to reveal some information that he is to record and faithfully record so that today we can look and say, what we're reading are words that came directly from God, given to Gabriel, and recited to Daniel to record for our purposes as well. As soon as you began to pray, a word went out which I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. So here's where the thing starts. 70 weeks. Now, we know that the word sevens in the Hebrew could mean days, it can mean months, it can mean weeks, it can mean years. In this case, it means years. And so we know that because we have evidence way back in Daniel chapter 7, for example, in verse 25, where it says, He, Antichrist, will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people. So this is a reference to when Antichrist will be in control and his holy people and try to change the set times for the whole set times and laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and a half a time. So a time, times, and a half a time is a reference to a time is 1 year, half a time is 2 year, or times is 2 years, and half a time is a half year. So it's a reference to 3.5 years. And the time when they are turned over, when, as we read here, the holy people will be delivered into Antichrist's hands for 3.5 years. That's the second half of the tribulation. Jesus referred to it as, excuse me, the Great Tribulation. So we know that it's not a reference to anything other than years. So this 70-week prophecy in the King James and other translations, it's not 77s, it's 70 weeks. Or as in the yeah, sure, you could. If they could, in the Hebrew, 77s, it would be a period of years. So 77s or 70 times 7 is 490. So this is a prophecy of it's gonna take 490 years from start to finish. And it won't start until a certain event takes place, which we'll get to in just a moment. So the prophecy represents both first and second coming of Jesus Christ. No portion of the Old Testament, thank you very much, is as important to unlocking the mystery of God's future plan for Israel than Daniel 9. This prophecy concerns the times of the Gentiles from Israel's perspective. Let's just keep your fingers here and go to Luke chapter 21. And in verse 24. And again, this is just another iteration of the Olivet Discourse. It's the same thing that is covered and outlined in Matthew 24 with some slightly different things that are added and taken away. But in verse 24, it says, They will fall by the sword and be taken prisoners to all nations. Then it says Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So what that means is that Jerusalem, Temple Mount, will be under the control of Gentile uh, powers, but only for a particular time. Now, some would say that this took place as a result or was fulfilled after the 1967 war, when Israel forced Jordan, that had control of the West Bank, or so-called West Bank, and East Jerusalem, which is where Temple Mount was. And so they forced them back. And for the first time in 2,600 years, Israel gained control of Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. And if you saw pictures of soldiers that for the first time in the millennia actually went to the Wailing Wall and prayed, it was pretty remarkable. But the problem was that Moshe Dayan, who was the leader of the military in Israel at that time, concerned that he was going to totally upset the Arab world, left administrative control of Temple Mount to the Arabs. And so while they had technically taken control, they left administrative control to the Arabs. Plus, we see very definitely when we get to the tribulation that Antichrist will control Jerusalem for a period of time. And so, in fact, that's where the abomination of desolation will take place. And so, this particular prophecy, the times of the Gentiles, while we can say that it certainly is moving in that direction, I don't believe it's been fully completed. So, afterwards will be the time of Israel's restoration after the 70th week. Let's take a look real quick. I think this is worth reading. Zechariah chapter chapter 8. I want to read verses 1 to 15. Zechariah is just such an amazing book. But here it states in chapter 8, the word of the Lord Almighty came to me. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I am very jealous for Zion. I am burning with jealousies for her. In other words, Zion, Jerusalem, was under the control, even at this time, of Gentile leaders. And because God's eyes are upon Jerusalem 24 hours a day, it's his city. And it's the city of the Jewish people. So Jerusalem plays a very, very important role as far as God is concerned. So he's jealous for Jerusalem. This is what the Lord says: I will return to Zion and dwell in Jerusalem. And that's likely a reference to the kingdom age after the tribulation when Jesus actually returns. He's going to rule and reign from a new temple in Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem will be called the faithful city, and the mountain of the Lord Almighty will be called the Holy Mount. That's referring to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Once again, men and women of ripe old age will sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each of them with cane in hand because of their age. Now, we know the millennium lasts, 1,000 years. And so we're now into the 1,000-year reign. Satan's gone, Antichrist is gone, the false prophet's gone. Jesus is ruling and reigning in perfect righteousness. And so the conditions in Jerusalem at this time are going to be amazing. The streets will be filled with boys and girls playing there. This is what the Lord Almighty says. It may seem marvelous to the remnant of this people at that time, but will it seem marvelous to me, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will save my people from the countries of the east and the west. This isn't Babylon that he's going to save them from, because that was just a single country to the north, essentially. This is a reference to the times in which we live today. when he's bringing the people of Israel back from the four corners of the earth, fulfilling what we're seeing today is the fulfillment of this and many other prophecies. I will bring them back to live in Jerusalem. You go back to 1948, they didn't control Jerusalem, and now Jews are living there. Granted, they're not very peaceful right now, but it's a stage setting for the coming kingdom age. I will be faithful and righteous to them as their God. That's important because that's not yet occurred. Jesus Christ, for the most part, is not yet the God of Israel. They have rejected him, but he will be. That's really the purpose of the tribulation, is to redeem and restore and to bring Israel to faith in Jesus Christ. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Now hear these words. Let your hands be strong so that the temple may be built. This is a new temple. This is the fourth temple. This is the temple that Jesus will build. The temple that's going to be built during the tribulation, or during the that Antichrist is going to allow, is not God's temple. It's going to be desecrated. It can't be the holy temple. So there's going to be the third temple, which is not yet built, and then the fourth temple, which we read about in great detail from Ezekiel chapter 40 to 48. This is also what the prophets said who were present when the foundation was laid for the house of the Lord Almighty. Before that time, there were no wages for people or hire for animals. No one could go about their business safely because of their enemies, since I had turned everyone against their neighbor. But now I will not deal with the remnant of the people as I did in the past. He's no longer going to punish them and cause them to go through the persecution. The seed will grow well, the vine will yield its fruits, the ground will produce its crops, and the heavens will drop their dew. I will give all these things as an inheritance to whom? The remnant of this people. What people? The Jewish people. Just as you, Judah and Israel, have been a curse among the nations, so I will save you, and you will be a blessing. Are they a blessing now? Well, they are. People just don't recognize what they have done and what they've meant for the world. Do not be afraid, but let your hands be strong. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Just as I determined to bring disaster on you and showed no pity when your ancestors angered me, so now I have determined to do good again to Jerusalem and Judah. Do not be afraid. Right now they're afraid, but when he comes back, they'll no longer be afraid. So, and then if we quickly go over to chapter 14, Zechariah, we won't read all of this, but just a couple of verses, beginning in verse 3. Uh, the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights on the day of the battle. On that day, he will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split into two. So when Jesus comes back, the Battle of Armageddon will be taking place in the Valley of Megiddo. Jesus is going to single-handedly go out and defeat those armies. We read that in Revelation that it's going to be such a gory thing when he does that, that the blood will be up to the horses' bridles in that particular place. The city will be captured. Where am I here? Then on that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. So he's going to defeat this great military that's come against Israel, come and trying to do everything it can to finally. It's under the control, under the leadership of Satan himself, bringing all the armies of the world, not some, but all, are going to come against Israel, come against Jesus Christ at the Battle of Armageddon. And then he's going to ascend the Mount of Olives. It'll split in two, and then great things are going to happen after that. So this is what we see is going to happen uh, after things take place. So as we mentioned last week, there are 7 prophetic goals that we read about in Daniel 9:24 that will be fulfilled when all 70 weeks are completed. And then he says again in verse 24, 77s or 490 years, that At the end of that 490 years, everything that he's going to outline right in this particular verse will take place. Some of them have taken place, some of them have not. So, decreed for your people in your holy city to one, finish transgression. That's the end of sin. That hasn't happened yet. To put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness. That certainly hasn't happened yet. To seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy place. So, these goals, as I say, these seven goals, establish the time of the prophecy's fulfillment. That's the end of the 70 weeks. That's what happens when Jesus comes back at the end of the tribulation. Some of the goals have been fulfilled during Christ's first coming. Most of these relate, all of them really relate to Israel's national, spiritual, and physical restoration, which won't occur until his second coming. So that's why it's all about Israel. It's important to note that fulfillment of these goals, again, relate exclusively to the people and land of Israel. And that's a very important thing to bear in mind. The tribulation, other than God pouring out his judgment on unrepentant sin, is about Jesus fulfilling all of the goals and all of the promises he's made to Israel. The goal to finish the transgressions or to bring an end to or to seal up or to make an end and to bring in indicate a finality. So what we see here in 924 is a finality. Everything that when Jesus comes back, all of these things will be fulfilled. The context does not point to fulfillment of these goals regarding the church. Again, important to understand. To seal up a prophecy, as stated here, is to preserve it until it is completely fulfilled, as stipulated in Jeremiah's chapter 30 to 33. And then most holy points to the Holy of Holies in the temple and points to the consecration or dedication at the time of the temple from a state of defilement. So that's when the Holy of Holies, it'll be most holy or become most holy when Jesus enters in to the fourth rebuilt temple that will be built during the early stages of the kingdom age. So just go back, and I'm just going to finish real quick. I'm not going to go through all of Jeremiah chapter 30 to 33. I would suggest you get a chance to read those 4 chapters because it really gets into in great detail uh, what lies ahead. And I'll just read a couple of verses and we'll quit here in just a moment. In Jeremiah chapter 30, beginning in verse 3. Like this. Beginning in verse 3, he says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will bring who? My people, Israel and Judah, back from captivity and restore them to the land." So just as we read in Amos chapter 15, when God brings them back from their captivity, from the 4 corners of the earth, never again are they going to be dispersed. Now, right now, we're hearing all this stuff about World War III breaking out in the Middle East, and I don't know how much worse it's going to get over there. I think that Hamas has been pretty effectively dealt with. Is it completely over? No. I don't know how bad it's going to get with Hezbollah and the Houthis, but there has to come between now and the time when Ezekiel 38 is fulfilled, a time when Israel thinks they're in peace and safety. And we haven't gotten there yet. But he says, I will bring my people, Israel and Judah, back from captivity and restore them to the land. So as we see Jews returning to Israel, it's God bringing them back. And he uses all kinds of of means and motivations to bring them back. Some came back after the Holocaust. Some are going back now because where is it safe for a Jew to be except for Israel? And so we're seeing this ongoing aliyah, which is the Jews returning to Israel from the four corners of the earth. God is bringing them back exactly as he said he would, to the land I gave their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that unconditional, everlasting, uh, uh, unilateral promise that that land belongs to them. This is where, how can Israel be an occupier? They own it. God gave it to them. You can't occupy what you own. The occupiers, and they're welcome to be there, by the way, are the Palestinians. So, gave their ancestors to the best of the Lord. These are the words the Lord spoke concerning Israel and Judah. This is what the Lord says. And I won't read through that, but let's move down to chapter or verse 7. This is where it really gets interesting and ties into Daniel and what we're seeing today. How awful that day will be. No other will be like it. It will be a time of trouble for Jacob. This is where we get the term time of Jacob's trouble. It's synonymous for the tribulation. That 7 year period, it's not the time of the church's trouble, it's the time of Jacob's trouble. And it's going to be horrible for the Jews during that period of time. 2/3 of the Jews are going to be killed during that period of time, during the second half of the tribulation. So it's a time of their trouble, and God's going to allow it to happen so that there will be a remnant of Jews that will ultimately accept Jesus Christ. But he will be saved out of it. In that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will break the yoke off their necks and tear off their bonds. No longer will foreigners enslave them. No more trying to create two-state solutions. This is the land God gave to the Jewish people, and they're going to receive it, and it's going to be glorious. Instead, they will serve the Lord their God. Hasn't happened yet, but it will. And David their king. David referring to here, in this case, the Lord Jesus Christ, that he will sit upon the throne of his father David. So this is an idiom when you see David here for the Lord Jesus Christ. Um, David, their king, who I will raise up for them. Remember, this is written some 700 years BC, so this is before the time of Christ or so. Do not be afraid, Jacob, which is, also means Israel. Do not be dismayed, Israel, declares the Lord. I will surely save you out of a distant place. Your descendants, the people today, from the land of their exile. Jacob will again have peace and security, and no one will make him afraid. That's what Israel has to look forward to uh, during the millennial kingdom. I am with you and will save you, declares the Lord. Though I completely destroy, this is pretty ominous right here. All the nations, pretty scary when you think about it, but we won't be here for that. Among which I scatter you. There aren't too many nations. I don't think there's any nations in the world that Jews were not scattered to. So that means that virtually the whole world's going to be destroyed during the tribulation at the very end. I will not completely destroy you. So what he's saying here is there will be a remnant, I think, as we read in Zechariah, 1/3 of the Jewish population will survive the tribulation. That's the group that that Jeremiah is referring to here. I will not let you go entirely unpunished. So clearly, we've seen that throughout the history books. So that's we got through a couple of pages of this. We'll dig into it a little more next time. Again, a critical, vital prophecy, and one as we'll see when we get to the um, actual timing is precise to the day. Absolutely amazing. So, and we're going to tie in another fascinating prophecy in the book of Zechariah and Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. That will be the end of the first 69 weeks of this prophecy. And it says that after that, he, and the King James says, will be cut off, which means killed. That signifies the end of the first 69 weeks, but not for his own sake. In other words, he's going to be killed for the sake of others. This is recorded in Daniel 700 years before it happens. And the day, the precise day when when he enters into Jerusalem on the back of that donkey and then is cut off after that is just amazing. Only God could have given such a precise prophecy. 173,770 days from the date, the decree to build Jerusalem until Jesus is crucified took place. It will show how that takes place, but can't make this stuff up. 1/7 to go. And we are headed toward that. Okay. Comments?
I took note of an implication that I never really dwelled on before, Daniel 9, verse 23. Daniel was a human being like we are. And in part of that verse, Gabriel says to Daniel, "For you are greatly beloved." He says, "I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved." The implication being that the God of heaven, that the powers to be in heaven are aware of what Daniel is doing.
Exactly.
It's I'm thinking of it in a more literal sense, probably, than I
Yeah.
thought of it in the past.
Right. What's interesting when you think about Daniel and the other one that really falls into the same category is Joseph. Unlike Abraham, unlike Isaac, Jacob, uh, David, the patriarchs, you don't find anything negative about Daniel anywhere. I mean, Abraham had his issues, and certainly David had his issues, and all of the patriarchs, Solomon, all of them had significant issues, but you don't find anything. And that's why I believe they refer to him as being highly esteemed. Not that he's more esteemed.
Or Jesus, God, he is being watched.
Right.
So does anything make us think that we are not being watched?
Uh-huh.
That's my point.
I know. That's a great point. Good point, too. So, comments, questions?
I had an interesting quote I read that you reminded me of when you were talking about how, sometimes these horrible things happen to people and we don't understand why, right? And the quote is, God allows the things he hates to achieve things he loves.
Mhm.
It's nice. Yeah. If anybody's interested in reading any articles about Israel, there's a website called the American Rant.
American what?
The American
Alright.
AmericanRant.com. And there's two articles. One's called Judeophobia, and another one is about why Israel is left towing the line alone. These were written a few years ago, but you would think they were written yesterday. But they're pretty compelling.
Interesting. Interesting. Israel is, it's just, I think that to me, people, often ask, I guess, what's the most significant thing that's happened recently? To me, it's the explosion of anti-Semitism that we've seen since October 7th. It's just, it's obviously been there all along, but see it just virtually around the world, in every major city in our country. It's just, it's unbelievable.
My
And it's,
friends are calling me and apologizing. They're saying sorry, that you're going through. And it's tragic, of course, we can only think of that.
Yeah.
And what we say is the mask is fallen. Like they're your next door neighbor, or they're your little kid's best friend. You know, half of our phone books are gone. Half the people we thought are our friends say stuff like, well, yeah, but you know, you did it first. I was insane stuff. And then you have the righteous goyim who say, like, this whole room, this makes me cry. Just you're with us, you understand, you get it, but you would be surprised how many people are the opposite. So
And
very
part of-
isolating.
Part of the irony of these protesters, the anti-Semite protesters, is that most of them don't even know what they're against.
Exactly.
And if they went there, they'd be killed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, have them go live in Gaza for a while and see what happens.
There was a funny scoop on that. Some guy went around to a college campus and said, are you supporting Gaza? Yes, great. Be here tomorrow at 7 a.m. Yes, great. The bus will pick you up, take you to the airport, then fly you to Gaza. And each student's like, oh, I have a test that day.
Well, how close is Adam Abramson to that area?
I think he's
He's
in
north-
Jerusalem,
he's north of
right?
North Seaville, which is- Yeah, very far north. He's a neighbor of yours, Savarti.
Because one of our former pastors has a son over there. He's in Jerusalem?
No.
That's what Jane said.
Oh,
I heard he moved, but I didn't know where he
well,
was.
well, his home is in North Carolina, but because of the October 7th war, or whatever you want to call it,
Massacre?
he would, those people moved temporarily to Jerusalem for protection.
Okay.
And then I was saying that. Had an update that was in that one, not necessarily to where you had come from. But it's part of the- But it's not still in Jerusalem.
I know. That's a very nice one.
So I heard that. That was a couple of years ago.
I just use it.
Yeah.